Everyone here. Amen. Okay, so we are starting a new sermon series called the Book of Advent, and it's all about how the Bible is a book of Advent, how God is doing something new inside of our own lives and our own faith, inside of all these old stories. He's doing all these new things. He's showing the advent of our faith in all these new ways, and it comes to us in unexpected ways. So, and today we're talking about Abraham. And as we were kind of talking about that, I'm going to introduce it too. But when we were talking about it, I was looking at the story of Abraham, and I was like, the story of Abraham is not too dissimilar from one of my favorite movies of planes, trains, and automobiles, right? So did everyone watch it yet this year? Has anyone not seen it before? Oh, you have Planes, Trains, and Automobiles? This movie is 35 years old. No more excuses, right? Like it's one of the best. And I will throw this warning out there for everyone who hasn't seen Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. The rating of this movie would be PG-13, except for one scene at the rental car counter. For that one, it has a a little farther rating there, right? And so like if that offends you or whatnot, you can fast forward to that little scene. But it's this movie is brilliant, and it shows us, I think, the story of Abraham and actually how God works even through our struggle in it. And to start it off, we need to start off with talking about the story of Abraham for a little bit. For those of you, it's my theory that if you can get just even a rudimentary understanding of Genesis and Exodus, those are written like one big book, but it's separated into two. If you can have a rudimentary understanding of Genesis and Exodus, you will understand the Bible just throughout. Like that. I think you'll just understand it better and how it's written and all these things. And one of the main stories found in Genesis chapter 12 is of Abraham. And God comes to Abraham, this guy who's named Great Father. That's what Abraham means, Great Father, right? Yet his problem is he doesn't have any kids. Can you imagine that being your name and then you don't have any kids? So that's Abraham, right? And God comes to him, this guy who is older, and says, hey, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to give you so many descendants, and the entire world is going to be blessed through your line, right? This is what he says to Abraham, and it's amazing. But we kind of work our way up to he and Sarah are old, and they still have not had any kids. And then in our story today, they get visited by three visitors. Now, these three visitors that were read by Jan a little bit ago, you can listen to some Christian theologians. They'll say that that's like the Trinity, like the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit coming and visiting Abraham. I don't know. I think that's stretching it a little bit. Like that's over there. I actually like the Jewish perspective a little bit more because it actually kind of comes from the text, I think. That it's actually like God, and then God's kind of like right and left hand. Type of, not literally like his right and left, like his servants on either side of him, his dignitaries, secretaries of state is what we would call them here, right? That is over there. And you can kind of see that in the text here. So I want to read this to you because it's kind of a funny story. So Abraham's got this promise, and then they have this three people kind of show up, and they say to Abraham, where is Sarah, your wife? And he's like, well, she's just in the tent right in there. She's over there. I promise she's not listening. And then the Lord said, and remember, that says, and the Lord, capital L-O-R-D, which that would mean the big name for God, like the Y-A-W-H, capital L-O-R-D. And the Lord said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son. Right? And she's old, right? Abraham and her are both super old at this time. They're so old. She's so old that, and it describes in the next sentence after this, it describes how old she is. And in Romans chapter 4, Paul describes how old she is as her womb being dead, right? As her womb being dead. And that's the thing, and that's kind of Paul's point. is that God can often take crosses and dead things and bring them back to life again. That's kind of what the point is. That's kind of what we see and see how things are working out, right? Like that's what he does. And so we fast forward to verse 12. And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. And so she laughed, right? She laughed to herself. She goes, after I am worn out and Abraham is old, shall I have this pleasure of being able to bear children? You know, I'm all worn out. Like in Abraham, he's so old too. Like I'm gonna have like this. And she laughs. And she laughs. And it made me like think about like this, and we're going to go through their story in a second, but their story is just a comedy of errors, right? Just things just go wrong after going wrong after going wrong in Abraham's life. And now, like, yes, God has promised twice that I'm going to, like, that the line is going to come through me, but here we are super old, and now it's going to happen? And it's just laugh. Have you ever laughed at how ridiculous something has gone on in your life? And you're like, why in the world is this? And as I was writing this and thinking about this story, I was like, it reminded me of that one scene in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, kind of near the end, where John Candy and Steve Martin are in the hotel room with the burned out, wrecked up heap of a car that they drove in to that hotel room, right? And they are traveling the world. They're going to Jamaica by drinking rum, and they're going to Mexico by drinking the little minibar tequilas, and all of these things, and they're laughing at the ridiculousness of it all, because they had to pay for that room with pocket change and a really nice watch, right? And they're in there and they just start laughing at the ridiculousness of it, right? One of my favorite scenes is they can't stop laughing here. And I think that's what we have here in Sarah. That's what we have here in Sarah. And so the thing to remember about Planes, Trains, and Automobiles is it's about a guy who's got his life all in order, and yet it's the buffoon that leads him to salvation, which is Thanksgiving dinner with his family, right? Like you guys, have you seen this movie before? You obviously don't like it. All right. Let's change up the sermon, all right? Like it's about this guy and it's a buffoon, but Steve Martin has his life all together, this character, right? He's got the briefcase, he's got the nice watch, he's got his gloves, he's got his nice professional looking jacket, and he's at a marketing meeting in New York, and he's got to get home for Thanksgiving. He's got to get home to Thanksgiving, and he is, this meeting runs late, and he's running to go get the airplane, right? But here's the thing that the movie does, and it starts to hint at this, is that Steve Martin is a man that's always in control. He doesn't need anybody else. And that idea is causing problems with his home life, right? It's causing problems with his wife. And it seems like he and his wife are kind of not doing that well, right? It's kind of what the story is telling. This is what's going on with Abraham. Because imagine Abraham walking on cloud 9, because God just said, you are going to be the one whom I'm going to bless. You know, everybody is going to be blessed because of you. How did Abraham walk for like a month or a year after that? He's like, oh man, I may be old right now, but God's going to give me offspring, and you all are going to be blessed. Would he walk around like, I am God's gift? You know, like, you guys need to look at me and look at what I'm doing, right? And like I must have played right at that one time, and that God would notice that, and he does all these things. But the thing is the errors start coming right away. Like that happens, and not 6 months later, does a famine happen in the land, and Abraham and his wife and everything that they have to rush to Egypt. Not 6 verses later, I said months, not 6 verses later, like they has to go to Egypt. And on the way to Egypt, Abraham looks, with just hearing the promise of God, he looks over at his wife and goes, honey, you're very pretty. I think the Pharaoh will think you're pretty too. I think he'll try to kill me. Why don't you say that you're my sister? Right? Like this is what he says. like this is what he does. He has just heard the promise that he is the promise of God, right? Like all these things. And he's already trying to give his sister away to Pharaoh, his wife away as his sister, right? Like that's what he's trying to do. Like, and God ends up sending plagues onto Egypt because of what he does and all that stuff. Like, kind of foreshadowing for what happens in Exodus, but we won't get into that right now. This all happens, and God protects that promise still. And then right after that, he and his nephew Lot, they have lots of animals themselves, and they start having disputes as to where to graze the different herds and all that stuff. And they get into huge arguments. We just had Thanksgiving. Did anyone get into a huge argument about where to graze? Like that's like over there. Like, I know how some of you work, like all that stuff. Like that's what happened, right? Like like they over there, and they split off. Lot goes into Sodom. Things don't go well for Lot there, and Abraham has to go in and do a military style like maneuver to rescue Lot. Right? Like it just falls apart all the more. It falls apart and falls apart and falls apart for Abraham, so much so that God has to remind him of the promise again. And God's like, listen, Abraham, look at the stars in the sky. Can you count them? That's how your descendants are going to be. And they do like a little covenant ceremony and everything. They do like a church thing. It's they make it official. And right after that, like the very next verses after all of that, Abraham and Sarah are talking like, ooh, we're just not able to get pregnant. We're getting very old. Perhaps we should, I should sleep with our slave Hagar. And that's the promise will go through that. Like again, he keeps he knows that the promise is going to happen, but he keeps trying to make the promise happen. And they have a son named Ishmael, and Sarah ends up abusing Hagar and all these things. Like it's not a good situation. And it gets us to the point here where these three people show up, and it ends up being the Lord. And they're like, in a year, you are going to be pregnant. You're going to have a son. And it's just like, what? No, surely not. Like we've been trying all these different things, right? Like it's almost like Abraham believed it, but didn't truly believe it. I mean, it's just like this movie of planes, trains, and automobiles. Like what happened? Like Steve Martin's character is in control the whole time, right? Yet his cab gets stolen. He walks in one of the best scenes. He tries to get on the plane to Chicago, and they bumped him out of first class into coach. And it's obvious in the movie the reason why they bumped him out is because it was the steward's boyfriend that was now sitting in first class. It's blatantly obvious there. And then he has to sit next to the guy in coach who stole his cab, which is John Candy. Right? And so they, it's this whole thing, this comedy of errors where they end up having to, there's all this snow that happens in Chicago because it never snows in Chicago. And they have to fly into Wichita. Now you guys aren't going to understand this, but man, Wichita, oh my goodness, Kansas. Me and Kansas have a beef. You need to understand that. I used to live in Arkansas. It made more sense when I was in Arkansas. But me and Kansas have a beef. One of my best friends in the world is from Kansas. This is why I have a beef, right? So they had to land in Wichita, and they get one room, and they only have one room left between the two of them. And they have to share a bed, right? And you have that classic line of, where's your other hand? It's between two pillows. Those aren't pillows, right? Like it's classic stuff in this movie, right? Like it's these things. It's just comedy of errors, and the train breaks down getting over there, and they finally have to get a rental car in St. Louis, and they're driving the rental car to Chicago, and then there's an incident with two semi trucks that cause them to wreck at these semis, and the car catches on fire, and there they are laughing in the middle of a hotel room that they paid for with watch and pocket change, just drinking at how the ridiculous of it all works out, right? Like that's like and I was just thinking about the story. I mean, this is how it works. Like Sarah's has had enough. She's like, this has been years. Years. Like, how in the world can this happen? My womb is as good as dead, is what Paul says, right? My womb is as good as dead. How in the world can anything come from this, right? And I think many times we look at our own lives and we're like, Jesus, this is just a comedy of errors. Like I can't believe that this happened in my life. And the only thing you can do is just laugh. Like things just haven't worked out the way that you wanted to, and you just laugh at it. And you're like, that situation is as good as dead. And I think that's kind of the point, is that many times there's crosses that we face in our life. And that Jesus faced the actual cross for us all. And we see that advent of God's love that happens in the cross and the resurrection. And I love how the Gospel of Mark, and we talked about this earlier this year, how the Gospel of Mark presents this cross love, this resurrected love of Jesus, as the women coming to the tomb, and they run away in amazement. That kind of sounds like that laughter to me, of just like, what is this just ridiculousness of the love of God that in our midst, that isn't looking like anything that we thought it would look like. And the story in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles takes this interesting turn right at the end. They finally get to Chicago, and they're talking at the L, like the elevated train in Chicago. They're finally talking there, and they're kind of leaving as friends. Like, Steve Martin has been trying to get away from John Candy's buffoonery the entire movie. But it's actually kind of John Candy's buffoonery is what keeps them going to Chicago. Every time Steve Martin gets away, everything falls apart for them. And they kind of leave as friends, and he starts going on the train by himself to his house, and he starts reminiscing about everything that happened to him. And he starts remembering all the ridiculous things. How John Candy kissed his ear that one night when they had to share that bed. How all these ridiculous things. Then he starts putting the story together. And he realizes that John Candy's probably homeless, and that his wife has died years ago. And he makes a decision there. And in the movie, it's subtle. It's subtle because it's a comedy first, but it's subtle that Steve Martin, he's finally free of John Candy, and he decides to turn around and go back for him. And in that moment, you see the advent of who Steve Martin really is. Neil Page in the movie, but no one cares about that. You see the advent of actually who he is. And you see the advent of how that symbolism of him turning back and going back for John Candy is the part where he goes back and actually repairs his relationship with his wife too. You see the advent of that, where he was willing to say that I don't have to do it just on my own. And that's the symbology of that, repairing that relationship with his wife as well. And they go back and have Thanksgiving together. And you see that in Abraham's life too, where in a year they have Isaac. And you know what Isaac means? Does someone, one of our Bible scholars, what does Isaac mean? Laughter. Good job. 5 stars. Laughter. It means, like, they named him Laughter. It's the ridiculousness of the whole situation, right? They name him over there. But God then comes to Abraham and asks him to sacrifice that very promise, right? And you could see that Abraham taking Isaac, that promise of all of that he was so proud of before, taking up to the very top of the mountain of God. And you can see that when he gets up there, that there's something that finally clicks in Abraham. That if God could repair, this is how Paul puts it, my wife's dead womb, then God could bring the dead back to life with the promise. And that we have those same things. And we see that he's finally free to be able to have faith. That we see this advent of Abraham and his actual faith. That he says that God will lead me through no matter what may come. And as we look at Advent and the ridiculousness of the story of Christmas, and for those of you who've been here a while, you know how I treat Christmas. The nativity, shepherds, wise men, all that stuff is ridiculous, and it shouldn't be there. None of it. For those of you who are new, welcome. I get to ruin Christmas for you this year. Like that. But in ruining it, you see that all these Christmas movies and holiday movies and all these things around there actually were on it the whole time. And we see the advent of our faith that hit in the midst of humbleness of that manger scene. The humbleness of it all, where we can go, if God can come in the midst of humbleness and struggle like that, then he can come for me. And that no matter what struggles I may have, that just may be my cross-shaped existence right now. And I know that there are always resurrections. So, we can go and we can be like Sarah, and we can look around, or we can be like Steve Martin, John Candy, and within reason, drink your Jamaican rum and laugh at the ridiculous of the situation, knowing that God will always lead us through. And I think that's good news. And we'll end right there. Let's say a prayer. Jesus, we thank you for this day, that you love us. We thank you for movies that we can enjoy. We thank you for the stories of your advents all through the Bible. Lord, continue to lead us towards you as we come towards Christmas, that we may see you with fresh eyes, with those Advent eyes, and see the new things that you are doing. Thank you, Jesus. Amen. So, thank you so much for listening to all of that. And